What happens when a powerful billionaire brings his humble employee to the most important dinner of his life? Clara never expected to be Julian Blake's last-minute companion at a high-stakes investor dinner. But when she finds her voice in a room full of millionaires, everything changes forever. Asterisk, welcome back, beautiful people. This story is where drama meets devotion, and where one glance can rewrite destiny. Asterisk, the crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the marble floor of the Blake Mansion's foyer, each shard of light dancing like fragments of Clara's shattered expectations. 3 years of invisible servitude had prepared her for many things, but not for the ice-cold command that would change everything. I need you to come to an important dinner tonight. Julian Blake stood in the doorway of his study, his charcoal suit impeccable despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. The financial newspapers scattered across his mahogany desk told the story his pride wouldn't let him speak aloud. His empire was crumbling, and tonight's dinner with the Meridian Group investors was his last chance to save it. Clara's fingers tightened around the dustcloth she'd been using on the antique vases. Sir, this isn't a request. His voice carried the same detached authority he used for everything else, from morning coffee preferences to million-dollar acquisitions. I need someone who will keep to herself and stay silent. Someone forgettable. The word hit her like a physical blow, though she'd trained herself not to flinch. Forgettable. That's what she'd been for 26 years, moving through the world like a ghost in other people's stories. The daughter who disappeared into foster care after her parents' accident. The scholarship student who cleaned offices to pay for community college. The maid who polished silver in a mansion where her annual salary couldn't buy a single piece of furniture. But something flickered behind her carefully neutral expression as she studied Julian's face. Beneath his commanding exterior, she caught a glimpse of something she recognized all too well. Desperation. The kind that came from having nowhere left to run. What time should I be ready? She asked quietly. Julian's green eyes flicked over her, calculating. 8:30. La Bernardine. Wear something appropriate. He turned back toward his desk, dismissing her with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never had to consider the weight of his words. Clara stood there for a moment. Longer, watching him rifle through documents with hands that barely trembled. She thought about the late nights she'd seen him pacing the halls. The phone calls that ended with him staring out at the city like a man watching his kingdom burn. She thought about the single photograph on his desk, turned face down for the past 6 months of a woman whose absence haunted every room in this house. Mr. Blake? Her voice was softer now, almost tentative. He looked up, irritation flashing across his features. Something shifted in his expression. Then, so brief she might have imagined it, for just a moment, the mask slipped, and she saw past the cold businessman to the man beneath, haunted, alone, carrying secrets that had carved hollows under his eyes. Then the moment passed, and he was Julian Blake again, untouchable and remote. Just don't speak unless spoken to, he said. I need invisible tonight, Clara. Can you manage that? She nodded, but as she left his office, her reflection caught in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at her had Clara's face, but something new burned in her dark eyes. Something that whispered she was tired of being invisible. Tired of being forgotten, tired of watching life happen to other people while she cleaned up their messes. At 8:15, she stood before her bedroom mirror in the one elegant dress she owned. A simple black sheath she'd bought for her college graduation ceremony that no one had attended.
The woman looking back at her now wasn't the meek maid
who'd agreed to Julian's command. This woman had straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and made a decision that would shatter both their carefully constructed worlds. Outside, the city glittered like a circuit board, all lights and possibilities and hidden dangers. Clara didn't know that in 3 hours, she would speak words that would destroy Julian's business deal and ignite something between them that neither could control. She didn't know that tonight would begin a game of secrets and lies that would force them both to choose between salvation and truth. We only knew that Julian Blake had made one critical error in judgment. He'd assumed that invisible meant powerless. La Bernardine's dining room hummed with the quiet power of money and influence. crystal glasses catching candlelight while the elite carved up empires between courses. Clara stepped through the entrance beside Julian, her heels clicking against marble that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. Julian's hand found the small of her back, a touch that burned through the silk of her dress.
I like to that.
To anyone watching, it looked possessive, intimate. Only Clara felt the tension in his fingers, the way he gripped her like she might bolt at any moment. "Remember what I said?" he murmured against her ear, his breath warm and commanding, silent, invisible. Duh. But Clara was already studying the room with eyes Julian had never bothered to notice, were sharp as cut glass. She catalogued everything. The way Richard Lawson dominated the corner table, despite being the shortest man present. How Margaret Chen's smile never reached her calculating eyes. The nervous energy radiating from David Park as he checked his phone every 30 seconds. These weren't just investors. They were predators, circling a wounded animal. And Julian was bleeding. "Gentlemen, Margaret." Julian's voice carried across the restaurant as they approached the table. Smooth and confident despite the desperation Clara had witnessed in his office. "Thank you for accommodating such short notice." Richard Lawson's eyes slid over Clara, with the dismissive assessment of a man accustomed to arm candy. "And who might this be, Clara?" Julian's introduction was clipped, purposeful in its brevity. No last name, no explanation, nothing that would suggest she mattered beyond tonight. Clara felt the familiar sting of invisibility, but this time, it felt different. Strategic. She smiled politely and took her seat, letting them think exactly what Julian wanted them to think. The dinner proceeded like a carefully choreographed dance of power and pretense. Julian presented his quarterly projections with the passion of a man fighting for his life, disguised as the confidence of someone merely seeking growth opportunities. The investors nodded and asked pointed questions that felt more like knives than curiosity. Clara listened to every word, every inflection, every meaningful pause. She'd spent 3 years invisible in Julian's world, and invisibility had taught her to hear the things people said when they thought no one was listening. She knew about the subsidiary in Singapore that was hemorrhaging money. She knew about the lawsuit being quietly settled in Delaware. She knew about the board meeting scheduled for Monday where Julian's position as CEO would be voted on. Also knew, from organizing his personal calendar and overhearing his phone calls, that Julian had built his empire on a foundation of calculated risks that were finally catching up with him. "The retail division shows promise," Margaret was saying, her manicured fingers drumming against the tablecloth. "But your overhead costs concern me, Julian, particularly the payroll." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I believe in investing in quality personnel." "Admirable," Richard interjected, cutting into his Wagyu beef with surgical precision. "But sentiment doesn't generate returns. Sometimes you have to make difficult choices." Clara knew they weren't just talking about layoffs. They were talking about stripping Julian's company for parts, keeping what was profitable and discarding the rest, including the scholarship program that had helped kids like her attend college, including the employee health care plan that covered families who couldn't afford insurance elsewhere. Speaking of personnel, David Park said with a smile that didn't hide his shark's instincts, "I'm curious about your companion's perspective." His gaze settled on Clara with predatory interest. "Clara, was it? What do you think of business dinners?" Like this, the question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Clara felt Julian's warning stare, felt the weight of his expectation that she would deflect with some modest, forgettable response. Instead, she set down her wine glass and met David's eyes directly. "I think they're fascinating performances," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Everyone here knows exactly what they want. But the real skill is in making it sound like you're offering something else entirely." The silence that followed was deafening. Julian's face had gone carefully blank, but Clara could see the storm building behind his eyes. Richard Lawson raised an eyebrow, his interest suddenly genuine rather than dismissive. "Interesting perspective," Richard said slowly. "And what do you think we're all performing tonight?" Clara could feel Julian willing her to stop, to retreat back into invisibility. But she'd spent too many years Watching powerful people play games with other people's lives while pretending it was just business concern, she replied. Everyone at this table is performing concern for Mr. Blake's company when what you really care about is how much you can extract from it once you gain control. Margaret's laugh was like breaking glass. My dear, I think you misunderstand the nature of investment. Clara's smile was sharp enough to cut. Because from where I sit, it looks like you're not interested in helping Julian's company succeed. You're interested in acquiring its assets at a discount when it fails? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian's hand clenched around his wine glass so tightly Clara thought it might shatter. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Clara with the intensity of a chess master who discovered his opponent wasn't the amateur he'd assumed. And if that were true, he said carefully, what would you suggest Mr. Blake do about it, Clara? Glanced at Julian, seeing her own reckless decision reflected in his furious green eyes. She'd just blown up his carefully planned evening, destroyed whatever slim chance he'd had of saving his company through traditional means. But sometimes, she realized, the only way to win a rigged game was to flip the board entirely. I'd suggest you stop playing by your rules, she said. The elevator to Julian's penthouse rose through 30 floors of silence so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Clara stood perfectly still, watching the numbers climb while Julian's fury radiated beside her like heat from a furnace. The doors finally opened. He stepped out without looking back, leaving her to follow him into the sprawling space that served as both his sanctuary and his prison. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city, but tonight the lights looked more like warning signals than promises. Julian poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon from the crystal decanter on his bar, downed it in one swallow, then poured another. His movements were controlled, precise, dangerous. 47 minutes, he said, without turning around. Clara set her purse on the marble counter. What? That's how long it took you to destroy 15 years of work? His voice was deadly quiet. Congratulations, Clara. You've just cost me everything. She watched his reflection in the window, saw the way his shoulders held the weight of his crumbling empire. They were never going to save your company, Julian. They were waiting for it to fail. He spun around then, and the raw fury in his eyes made her take a step back. You think you understand what happened tonight? You think your little performance accomplished something? I think I told the truth. The truth. He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The truth is that Richard Lawson controls 60% of my outstanding debt. The truth is that Margaret Chen holds the patents I need for the Singapore expansion. The truth is that without their support, I have exactly 8 days before my board votes me out and liquidates everything I've built. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. I didn't know, of course you didn't know. He slammed his glass down hard enough to crack the marble. Because you're the maid. Clara, you clean floors and arrange flowers and pretend to understand a world you've never been part of. The words hit like physical blows, each one precisely aimed to wound. But Clara had survived worse than Julian Blake's anger. She'd survived foster homes where she was nothing but a monthly check. Survived classrooms where her second-hand clothes marked her as different. Survived years of being told she didn't matter. You're right, she said quietly. I am the maid. I've spent 3 years invisible in your world, watching and listening while people like you make decisions that affect thousands of lives without thinking about the consequences. People like me. His voice dropped to a whisper, which somehow made it more menacing than shouting. People who think power means you don't have to consider anyone else's humanity. She stepped closer, meeting his glare with steady eyes. You know that Maria, in your kitchen, sends half her paycheck to her mother in El Salvador? That James, the security guard, is working nights here to pay for his daughter's cancer treatments? That your scholarship program is the only reason kids, from neighborhoods like mine, get to dream about something better? Julian's jaw worked, but no words came. Those investors weren't just talking about cutting costs, Clara continued. They were talking about cutting people. Real people with families and dreams, and nowhere else to go when you decide their lives aren't worth your profit margins. You think your moral grandstanding saved them? The question came out raw, wounded. You think destroying my last chance to keep this company afloat helped anyone? Clara saw the moment his control cracked, saw the pain he'd been hiding beneath all that fury. This wasn't just about business for Julian. This was about something deeper, something personal that had nothing to do with quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. "Tell me about her," she said softly. Julian went very still. "What? The woman in the photograph on your desk? The one you turned face down 6 months ago?" For a moment she thought he might tell her to get out, might fire her on the spot. For crossing a line she had no right to cross. Instead, he sank into one of the leather chairs that cost more than her annual salary, suddenly looking older than his 34 years. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was a social worker, okay? Always telling me I needed to think about the bigger picture, about how my decisions affected people I'd never meet." Clara sat on the edge of the coffee table, close enough to see the pain etched into the lines around his eyes. "She died in a car accident coming home from one of her cases, some kid from a broken home who needed her help." His hands shook as he reached for his bourbon. "The last thing she said to me was that she was proud of the scholarship program, that it was proof I wasn't just another heartless businessman." The pieces clicked into place then, painting a picture Clara had never seen before. Julian's increasing isolation, his obsession with work, his desperate need to save a company that had become his only connection to the woman he'd lost. "The board wants to cut the scholarship program," she said, understanding flooding through her. "First thing on their agenda?" His smile was bitter as winter. "Sarah's legacy wiped out to improve the bottom line. And thanks to your little speech tonight, I won't have the power to stop them." Clara stood up, pacing to the window where the city spread out below them like a circuit board of broken dreams. When she turned back, Julian was watching her with eyes that held too much pain for one person to carry. "There's another way," she said. "What are you talking about?" Clara took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would change everything between them, would cross lines. Neither of them could uncross. "Marry me." Julian stared at Clara as if she'd just suggested they burn down Manhattan. "What did you just say? Your trust fund?" Clara said, her mind racing through possibilities. She'd pieced together from overheard phone calls and financial documents she'd glimpsed while cleaning his office. "The inheritance your grandfather left you, still tied up in stipulations about marriage and stability, isn't it?" Julian's face had gone carefully blank, but Clara caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You've been listening to my private conversations? I've been invisible for 3 years. You'd be amazed what invisible people hear." She moved closer, her voice urgent. $50 million that you can't access unless you're married by your 35th birthday, which is when? Next month, the admission came out barely above a whisper. A marriage would give you the capital you need to buy out the investors, maintain controlling interest, and save the scholarship program. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. It would also give you time to implement the changes Sarah wanted to see. Julian stood abruptly, running his hands through his dark hair. "This is insane. You're talking about a business arrangement, not a marriage." "Sarah's gone, Julian." The words came out gentler than Clara intended, but her dreams don't have to die with her. He whirled around, eyes blazing. "Don't you dare use her memory. To manipulate me? I'm not manipulating you. I'm offering you a solution." Clara lifted her chin, meeting his anger with steady resolve. 6 months, long enough for you to access the trust fund and stabilize the company. Then we get divorced. I disappear from your life, and you never have to see the maid who caused you trouble again. And what do you get out of it? His voice carried a cynical edge that cut deeper than his earlier fury. "What's your angle, Clara? Money? A piece of my company? Chance to play dress-up in a world where you don't belong?" The accusation hung. Between them like poison, Clara felt something twist in her chest, a pain she hadn't expected. "I get to know that Maria keeps her job," she said quietly. "That James can pay for his daughter's treatment. That kids like me still have a chance at college." Julian studied her face, searching for the lie he was certain had to be there. Clara let him look, knowing he would see only the truth she'd been carrying for 26 years, that sometimes the only power you had was the choice to stand up, even when it cost you everything. "You're serious," he said finally. "Completely. The business arrangement. 6 months. No complications. Clara nodded, ignoring the way her heart clenched at his clinical tone.
Yeah, no complications.
Shh. Julian walked to the window, staring out at the city they'd both grown up in from opposite sides of its vast divide. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man making a deal with the devil. There would be conditions, appearances to maintain, events you'd need to attend, people you'd need to convince. The board, the media, society functions where one wrong move could expose everything. I understand. Do you? He turned back to her, and something in his expression had shifted. Because the woman who had married Julian Blake couldn't be the invisible maid anymore. She'd need to be someone who could hold her own in boardrooms and ballrooms. Someone who could stand beside me and make them believe she belonged there. Clara thought about the girl she'd been, growing up in foster homes where she'd learned to make herself small, unnoticed, safe. Then she thought about the woman who'd spoken truth to power tonight, who'd watched Julian Blake's carefully constructed world crumble and decided to offer him her hand to help him rebuild it. I can do that, she said. Julian's smile was sharp as a blade. Can you? 'Cause my world doesn't forgive mistakes, Clara. The people in it will smell your background like blood in the water. Will test you, challenge you, try to break you. Just to see if they can. Let them try. Something flickered in Julian's eyes then, something that looked almost like respect. He moved toward her with the predatory grace of a man who'd spent his life negotiating hostile takeovers. If we do this, he said, stopping close enough that she could smell his cologne, feel the heat radiating from his skin, there's no room for sentiment. No romantic fantasies about what this could become. You're not Cinderella, and I'm not your prince. This is business. Clara nodded, even as every nerve in her body screamed awareness of his proximity. Business. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Clara's breath caught. Sarah's ring, he said, his voice steady, despite the pain that flickered across his features. My grandmother's before that. If we're going to sell this performance, we might as well do it right. He opened the box to reveal a stunning vintage. Diamond, elegant and classic, and perfect for a love story that wasn't theirs. Clara stared at it, knowing that accepting it would mean crossing a line she could never uncross. The engagement will be announced tomorrow morning, Julian continued. Wedding in 3 weeks. Honeymoon in the Maldives, where no one can scrutinize us too closely. Then back to New York to play the happy couple while I save my company. Clara looked up from the ring to meet his eyes, seeing herself reflected in their green depths. In 6 months, this would all be over. Julian would have his company, his trust fund, Sarah's legacy preserved. And Clara would disappear back into invisibility, carrying the secret of their arrangement like a scar. House, she whispered. Julian slipped the ring onto her finger, and Clara felt the weight of it like a chain. But when she looked up at him, she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, something that looked dangerously like hope. Mrs. Blake, he said, testing the words. Mr. Blake. They stood there for a moment, two wounded souls, bound together by necessity and secrets, neither admitting that this felt like more than business. Outside, the city glittered with promise and peril, unaware that tomorrow, the engagement announcement would set in motion a chain of events that would test every assumption they'd made about love, loyalty, and the price of redemption. 3 weeks later, Clara stood in the bridal suite of the St. Regis Hotel, staring at her reflection in a wedding dress that cost more than most people's cars. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the invisible maidhood, agreed to this charade. Professional stylists had transformed her into someone who could believably marry Julian Blake. But the eyes staring back at her held secrets that no amount of makeup could hide. The door opened behind her, and Julian stepped inside wearing a tuxedo that made him look like every woman's dream of the perfect groom. Except Clara knew the truth about dreams. They had a way of turning into nightmares when you least expected. "It beautiful," he said, but his voice carried no warmth. 3 weeks of playing the devoted fiancés for cameras and skeptical board members had honed his performance to perfection. "Are you ready?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. These past weeks had been a whirlwind of engagement parties and press interviews, of learning to navigate Julian's world while pretending she belonged there. She'd discovered she was a better actress than she'd imagined, smiling and laughing, and playing the part of a woman in love with devastating conviction. The dangerous part was how often she'd forgotten it was an act. "There's something you need to know," Julian said, his reflection joining hers in the mirror. "Before we do this," Clara's heart stopped. "What?" "Richard Lawson knows." The words hit her like ice water. "Knows what? About the arrangement? About why we're really getting married?" Julian's jaw was tight with controlled fury. "He had you investigated the day after our dinner, found out about your background, your parents, your real reasons for working at the mansion." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "My real reasons?" Julian turned her around to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders, despite the storm in his eyes. "Duh. Your father didn't die in a car accident, Clara. He died because Richard Lawson's construction company cut corners on a building project. Faulty wiring caused the fire that killed your parents and 12 other families." The room spun around her. Clara grabbed the edge of the vanity to keep from falling. "You knew," she whispered. "You've known this whole time. I found out too. Weeks ago, Richard made sure I did." Julian's voice was raw with something that sounded almost like guilt. "He wanted me to know that my devoted fiancée had manipulated her way into my life for revenge." Clara stared at him, seeing the doubt in his eyes, the careful distance he'd maintained despite their growing closeness. "And you believed him?" "I didn't know what to believe." Julian's admission came out barely above a whisper. Everything made sense suddenly. Why you spoke up at the dinner, why you proposed this arrangement, why you were so concerned about the scholarship program. "Because it was never about the money for you, was it?" Clara's voice was steadier than she felt. "It was about making Richard pay for what he did to your family." Clara wanted to deny it, wanted to tell him that she'd fallen for him somewhere between the engagement announcement and the moment. She'd watched him reading bedtime stories to the children at the hospital charity event. But Julian deserved the truth, even if it destroyed whatever fragile thing had grown between them. "Yes," she said. "At first," Julian's hands dropped from her shoulders. "At first, I got a job at your mansion because I knew you did business with Richard Lawson. I thought if I could find something, some evidence of corruption or fraud, I could finally make him pay for what he took from me." Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years burned behind her eyes. "But then I got to know you. I saw how you carried Sarah's memory, how much the scholarship program meant to you, how hard you tried to be the man she believed you could be, so you decided to seduce me instead." The accusation cut deep, but Clara forced herself to meet his eyes. "I decided to save you instead, because somewhere along the way, your dreams became more important to me than my revenge." Julian stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for the lie he wanted to find. "Richard's given me a choice," he said finally. "Call off the wedding and expose your deception publicly. Or go through with the marriage and watch him destroy everything anyway. He has enough evidence of fraud in my company's books to put me in prison. Fraud you didn't commit. Fraud committed by my CFO with my signature on documents I trusted him to prepare." Julian's smile was bitter. "Apparently my faith in people has been my weakness all along." Clara felt something break inside her chest. "So what are you going to do?" Julian straightened his bow tie, his expression settling into the cold mask she remembered from their first meeting. "I'm going to marry you, then I'm going to divorce you. And then I'm going to spend whatever freedom I have left making sure Richard Lawson gets what he deserves." "Julian, no." His voice cut through her protest like steel. "Whatever this was, between us, it's over. You got your revenge, Clara. You destroyed the man who took your parents from you. I hope it was worth it." He moved toward the door, but Clara's voice stopped him. "I love you." Julian went very still, his hand on the doorknob. "I know you don't believe me," Clara continued, her voice breaking. "I know you think this was all part of some elaborate plan. But I love you, Julian. I love your stubborn determination to save everyone but yourself. I love how you remember the names of every scholarship recipient and their majors and their dreams. I love that you still talk to Sarah's picture when you think no one's listening. Julian's shoulders trembled, but he didn't turn around. I love you, Clara whispered again. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell you the truth before someone else did. For a moment she thought he might turn around, might cross the room and tell her that love was enough to overcome betrayal and lies and the weight of their respective damages. Instead, he opened the door. The ceremony starts in 10 minutes, he said without looking back. Don't be late. Clara stood alone in the bridal suite, wearing a dress meant for a fairy tale that had turned into a tragedy. In 10 minutes, she would walk down the aisle and marry a man who would never trust her again. In 6 months, she would divorce him and disappear from his life forever, carrying the knowledge that she'd found love and lost it through her own choices. But maybe that was enough. Maybe loving someone meant being willing to sacrifice your own happiness for theirs, even when they'd never know the price you'd paid. Clara picked up her bouquet and walked toward the door, ready to marry Julian Blake one last time. 6 months later, Clara signed the divorce papers in a lawyer's office overlooking Central Park. Julian sat across from her, immaculate in his business suit, giving nothing away. The trust fund had saved his company. The scholarship program had been expanded. Richard Lawson was awaiting trial for multiple counts of fraud and manslaughter. The penthouse is yours, Julian said as she handed back the papers. And there's a settlement. I don't want your money. And what do you want? Clara looked at him one last time, memorizing the face she'd loved and lost and would carry with her forever. I want you to be happy, Julian. I want you to find someone who deserves the man Sarah helped you become. She walked out of his life then, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and the ghost of what might have been. 5 years later, Clara opened her own nonprofit organization dedicated to helping children who'd lost parents in preventable accidents. The funding came from an anonymous donor who sent a single white rose with each quarterly check. She never signed the cards, but she kept every one. The end.